Good afternoon. Welcome to Establishing Baseline Scope Process and Scope Change Control Process in eBuilder, a briefing with the MBTA hosted by ACEC Massachusetts. Welcome to Courtney Lackard, who will be our trainer this afternoon. And with that, I'm going to ask Rob to share the screen.
Is the screen
visible? You can share your screen again? Sorry.
No, that's my bad. I am not used to Teams, so apologies if I'm a little bit slow with all of this. How's that?
Perfect.
Fantastic.
All right, so again, good afternoon, and let's get started. We have our agenda for this session. We're going to be doing two, one after the other. So we're starting out here with the baseline and process. We have an overview, purpose, exception, and then we do a walkthrough on the process with the PMIS representative, right? So, why are we doing this? It's really a process that we wanted to establish at the 30%. Over the years, we've been just moving along without real benchmark for looking at projects. Couple of years ago, 23 rather, we decided to just establish a draw line and just set a baseline for projects and wherever they were in flight. Now we want to be more realistic in how we set these baselines. And so at the 30% of design, we will pause the project momentarily to allow the baseline and process. We are expecting that at that point, after all comments, PDG comments, value engineering, constructability, and risk comments are then addressed in the document, and that's the document that will be submitted. So it will be
going out.
the phase just right after, just the phase right after we're finished with the review, and there's a period of time for the incorporation of all the comments. The project office will we made a change here because some questions were asked. We were going to have the project office not progress the design until after the process is complete. But we realize in this, we will lose momentum on the design. And so we will allow the design to progress while the review is taking place. And we will use the eBuilder process, or the name is going to be changed now, right? From eBuilder to something else, but it's the MEBS process that will be used, right?
So the purpose of this process is to ensure that everyone involved in the project understands the project's deliverables and the expectations. It is to help track progress against the schedule, identify potential delays, and implement corrective actions. It will also help track the actual costs against the budget amounts, identifying potential cost overruns and savings. It will help prevent scope creep that may lead to cost overruns and delays, and it will help to manage and track design changes when they occur, ensuring that they are properly documented and their impact on the project is assessed. There are a couple of exceptions to this process. The following may be permitted to request a waiver for establishing the baseline scope process. And we have created a waiver template that is available within the SOP. So the following may request the waiver: projects with limited scale or scope that fall under tier 1 of the project controls tier schedule. And that includes projects that have a value of less than $1 million in the construction contract. It also includes on-call projects can get the waiver as well. The project office project manager must submit the baselining waiver request form with justification and approval from the chief of capital delivery or transformation. Here's a brief overview of the eBuilder process, but Rob will go through some of the steps for it. Initially, the process is started by the designer by submitting the required materials, as well as confirming that the 30% PDG and workshop comments have been incorporated into the documents that are being uploaded. So this isn't the original 30% documents. You'll have the PDG meeting, you'll have the constructability, the VE, and the risk. And then all of those comments will get incorporated or addressed in some way into the 30% designs and specs. And then those documents will be what get uploaded into the initiation step of this process. Then it will go to the project office for review. The MBTA project manager shall confirm that the 30% PDG and workshop comments have been incorporated into the uploaded design, plans, specs, and schedule. The MBTA project manager shall submit their additional required materials. Then it goes to project controls for concurrence. The project controls analyst shall validate project costs and schedule and work with the budget analyst to ensure funding is available. Then it goes to the project director for concurrence. Project director shall provide any necessary comments prior to the process being sent to the scope management committee. The scope management committee is a new committee that we've developed with representatives from different parts of the MBTA. And this will be seen in both of these new processes. So the scope management committee review step is the final step. The scope management committee shall convene and review the project baseline request and provide a final disposition.
All right, now I am going to demonstrate what all this looks like within eBuilder itself. So let me switch over. So from the very beginning, this is the home screen. When you go to ebuilder.gov, this is what you should see after you log in. You have at the top My Processes. Everything that's in this section is technically considered in your report, and you are responsible. Oh, am I still sharing my screen? Thank you.
Rob,
Yes,
you're
you
up.
are.
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. It's not going up there for some reason. All right, thank you. So from your home screen, you're going to navigate to the project that you wish to establish the baseline scope on. So from that, at the top right, you have an all projects bar. This is a very large drop down that should contain every project that you have access to see. For me, I'm an admin on the system, so I can see every project. And since I don't want to affect an active project, I'm going to be using a testing project just to make sure I don't break anything that's actively being used. So once you navigate to your project, you'll be brought directly to the documents module, which on the left side, you see this project menu. We're on the documents. You want to go one above that to processes. This is where you can find all the processes that have been done on this project. Normally, if there's an ongoing process, you'd use these filters in order to get there. But since we are starting the baseline establishment process, you're going to want to use this blue Start Process button. This will come up with a list of processes that you have permission to start on this project. I have a much more extensive list than you guys will see. However, what you want to find is the establishing baseline scope process. There are multiple ways you can do this. You can scroll through this list if you just want to manually go through, or using a keyword like scope will get you there much quicker. So in this case, I looked up scope. You can see the two processes we're reviewing today: establishing baseline scope on top, project scope change control on the bottom. For now, we're just going to be looking at this MEBS, establishing baseline scope process. So by selecting it, you'll see it has a little check mark next to it, and then the button at the bottom says Start MEBS. So if you select that, it'll start the process. I already have a draft instance of this process because I don't think you guys want to see me fill in every single one of these fields. So I've pre-populated an instance, but this is what you would expect to see. So before I go through everything on this page layout, I'm going to start by demonstrating exactly what the workflow looks like on this process. So this is very similar to what Kaylee just explained regarding how the flow works. So from the start, there's this green start button. This is where we are right now, the beginning of the process, the basic information that you as a consultant will enter. It'll then be sent off to the project office for review. Project office is going to be submitting additional documentation on top of what you submit in the start step. And they're going to be confirming that the 30% PDG comments have been incorporated into the documentation that you have provided. Then it goes off to the project controls concurrence. This is where project controls verifies the schedule and the budget of the project, making sure that this scope can be achieved with what has been allocated to the project. If everything looks good, it goes off to the project director for concurrence. This is just a review step. They're going to be reviewing all the documentation that has come in so far, make sure that everything looks good before finally sending it off to the scope management committee for review. Again, this is a new committee. They're going to be meeting on a fairly frequent cadence, and they will be reviewing all new baseline scopes as well as scope changes in order to determine their merit. Then the project or the process closes out, generates a final package that will be used as record of this scope being established before the process finishes. One thing I do want to call out is there is a revise and resubmit step. So both the project office can choose to return it to you if they determine that something is off or additional information or documentation is necessary. So essentially see this start step and this initiate a revise step as exactly the same step because the same information is visible on both. Returning to the page layout, this is a pretty standard page layout. If you have used processes before in the system, you should be aware of the basic flow that we try to create with these page layouts. So from the very top, we have this blurb of what project the process is on, the process name itself, the subject for process. Then we have our tabs. Details tab is where you're going to be entering all the information into fields. The documents tab is where all the documents that you provide will show up. Even if you're entering it into a field on the details page, it'll show up in the documents tab. And then there's attached processes and attached forms, which aren't relevant to this process. So scrolling down at the top, we have instructions. Please read these instructions. We've tried to make them as detailed as possible. We also try to spell out exactly what actions you can take from the step and when you should take those actions. From the start step, there's only one action, so that makes it incredibly easy. You can only submit. Right below that, we have links. So we try to also provide you access to the documentation that supports this process. So we have a link to the SOP. If you need to get a waiver, you should go to the SOP and the waivers will be linked in the SOP. And then we also have a user guide, which is essentially a step-by-step of how to use this process. A little more detailed than the instructions we provide on each page layer. Scrolling down, I'm going to come back to this concurrence reviews because really what we're interested in this start step is this baseline information. It's a series of documents that you have to provide to the project office and to project controls in order for them to verify and agree to your baseline establishment. So from the top, we're looking for the basis of design report, the design plans, the design specifications, the cost estimate in PDF format, the cost estimate in XLS or Excel format, the CTD schedule narrative in PDF format, the CTD schedule in PDF format, the CTD schedule in XER or MPP format, and then lastly, the geotechnical baseline report, which is not required unless subsurface work is required during construction. So you can see there's no little red asterisk next to this geotechnical baseline report because it's not always going to be required. Once all those documents have been provided, we're going to return to the concurrence review section where we ask you to confirm that all the documents you have provided have addressed and incorporated all of the 30% PDG comments. Additionally, there is a free text box for you to leave any comments that you feel is necessary for the MBTA to know. Once all the documents have been provided and your concurrence reviews have been filled out, you're going to use this submit button at the top, and this is going to push the process along to the project office. Now, I'm not going to go through every single review throughout the process because that's going to take all day, and I know we're all very busy. But just know it goes to the project office next. They're providing additional documentation, project controls to confirm the scope and budget, project director for a final review before it goes to the scope management committee for a final yes or no on whether or not your scope is going to be approved. Once all this happens, the process creates a final package, and this final package is fairly relevant, so I'm going to show it off to you. So this is a finished version of this process, and we have this establishing baseline scope package that has been generated. So from the top, we have a very basic cover letter, shows everyone who's acted and in what step. Of course, it's me in every step right now because this is a testing instance, but it'll show the appropriate names of the people who reviewed and the date that they reviewed, as well as any comments that all the reviewers have left. Scrolling through the package, we have the basis of design, the design plans, the design specifications, the project schedule, the project budget, the cost estimate, the CTD schedule narrative, the CTD schedule, value engineering report, risk assessment report, constructability report, the PMP document, geotechnical baseline report, if necessary, the risk and contingency management plan. And then lastly, we have this document, and this is the document that the scope management committee is signing off on. Each of the attending members' names will be filled out along with their final disposition of whether or not they approve or deny. And then one of the scope management committee co-chairs will sign off on this, as well as providing a final disposition of whether or not the baseline scope has been approved or rejected. This package has a combination of documents that both you, the consultant, and the project office provides throughout this process, and will be used as the final record of this scope being established. However, at this point, the process would be over. A large majority of this process exists solely within the MBTA. Only the very beginning is where you, the consultant, will see this process and have to submit information. This final package will be transmitted to you upon process completion. However, with that very quick overview of what this process is expecting, for you guys, it's mostly just providing documentation so that the MBTA can start working on establishing scope. And before we move over to the scope change control process, Courtney would like to add some information.
Yeah, where we are asking for the budget and that is the full project budget that we're looking for. The estimate is really the 30% construction estimate. But the budget would be the full project budget to include design costs, and all soft costs, as well as the construction estimate. Just want to make that distinction. Thank you.
All right. And now we are going to be moving over to the scope change control process. Give me a second to open this up for you.
Just like the baselining, we have the overview, purpose, the goal, and the process. Bear in mind that we had initially done these separately. When we first put these processes together, we introduced the scope change process first, and then the estimating process. So there have been some slight changes since then, right? So the whole thing about establishing the baseline is such that when we are asked to make changes, we have something to measure against. So the project scope then provides all the detail that we need. We want to be sure that we are managing the expectations, we are managing whatever we have baselined. And so when stakeholders approach, and it's usually the designers that they approach with a request to change the scope, that we are following this process to make sure all the changes are done. These are owner requested changes. And let me just emphasize that these are owner requested scope changes. These are not incidental field changes. So if the project is in construction and there is a change condition, that is not one that is required to go through this process. This only is for an owner, one of the stakeholders requests some change that is not part of the original scope. For example, we're doing elevators and we are moving along in construction. Stakeholder pops up and says, oh, by the way, this escalator also needs to be redone. Could you add the escalator in the scope? That is a scope change. That is one that we would have to introduce into this process. Okay.
So the purpose of this process is to ensure that the budget, schedule, and technical impacts of proposed changes are developed. And as Courtney stated, it's only major changes to the project. Collected evaluations are considered in the disposition of proposed changes. Baseline documentation is controlled and updated through this process. Verification that funding is in place to support the scope change request. Approval is obtained at the appropriate delegated authority level for the forecasted cost of the scope change request. And actions are deliberate without undue delay and disproportionate interference with project progress. The goal of this process is to anticipate, recognize, and predict changes to the approved project scope and ensure each change is evaluated, reviewed, and dispositioned at the proper level of authority. So here's a bit of an overview of the request phase of the process. Either the MBTA project manager or the designer can initiate the process in eBuilder, and the process is titled Project Scope Change Control, or MPSCC for short. The information required to start the process is an approved 30% baseline or the most recent basis of design, project management plan, project charter, or asset data. Description and justification of proposed change, design scope change proposal from designer, MBTA internal scope change estimate, impact assessment, both internal and external, the design cost and schedule, the construction cost and schedule, and operations. The scope change includes significant schedule and cost changes. The project controls analyst will validate that the funding is available for the scope change and that it is not scheduled for future spending on another item. So the difference between the scope change and scope development is highlighted in that box. Scope change includes contractual modifications, replanning, reprogramming, and application of undistributed budget and contingency money. Scope development, on the other hand, is design refinement within the designer's original scope, further development of design criteria, or baseline document preparation to final design, construction, or testing startup phases of the project. Next up is the review and approval phase of the process. The MBTA project office will negotiate with the designer of record. The scope management committee, as we mentioned in the previous process, is a brand new committee, but it is the same committee in this process as it is in the other process. They review and analyze change requests and provide the final disposition. Management representatives from engineering and capital division, capital planning, operations, safety, the office of the general manager, project controls, and design QA all make up the new committee, and project controls and design QA will be the two co-chairs of the committee. Final approval is obtained from the appropriate level of authority and will be based on the forecasted estimate of the scope change. So in the disposition step, this is the first part of the documentation phase. It's where the project scope is adjusted and the approval change is implemented. So in the disposition, the change request is signed by the proper level of authority after the scope management committee review. The budget reallocation or amendment is the next step. Follow the standard operating procedures as set for professional services under contract management. Then we've got the revised project baseline, documenting any change to the scope and closing a change. The project office and designer implements the amendment within the scope of work. So here is the responsibility assignment matrix. As you can see, the scope change initiation can happen by either the MBTA project office or the designer. Then we'll have impact assessments by the MBTA project office, the designer, and MBTA project controls. Those are each different steps. Then there will be a QA/QC and review done by the MBTA project office and MBTA project controls in 2 different steps. Then there will be a final review and disposition by the scope management committee, and the scope change implementation will be done by the MBTA project office and the designer.
As while Rob is getting the process going, we have, which Rob is not aware of this yet, but we have some modification coming on this process where once the stakeholder makes the request, they would have to submit this in writing via a memo. And then the scope change committee will review that request before the process gets started. That way, we are not waiting until we go all the way through the process to get a rejection. We'll get the rejection right up front before the process starts. Also, we've added some additional members to the committee to allow for changes in particular to the core capacity program.
Thank you, Courtney. All right. Hello, everyone. It is me again. This time we're going over the scope change control process. So instead of starting from the home screen this time, I'm starting from my project. So navigated to my testing project. I'm in the processes tab on the project menu to the left. Same as before, if you use the blue start process button and look up scope, you will find both scope processes. However, this time we are focusing on the project scope change control process. This process is only to be used after your original scope has been established, and this is to modify that established baseline scope. Again, we have some pre-populated instances of this so that we don't have to watch me upload documents for 20 minutes. I will start by showing off the workflow diagram. This process is fairly more in-depth than the previous process we looked at. But from the top, we start in the start step. This process can be initiated by both you, the consultant, or the MBTA project office. You're going to be providing a bunch of basic information regarding the project and the established baseline scope and some documentation before sending it off to project controls for review. Project controls will provide the review and either choose to send it off to the project office, or they can revise it back to you, the consultant, for additional changes to be made. The project office does their impact assessment. They provide an ICE, and then they send it off to you, the designer. So this process, you can see it twice, once in the start step and once in the designer impact assessment. In this designer impact assessment step, you are providing your own impact assessment. That impact assessment will be compared against the project office impact assessment in the next step, the project office negotiation step. The project office will interface with the consultants in order to make sure that everyone is on the same page regarding what the additional scope, time, and budget are for this scope change control. Once the negotiations have been completed and both parties agree, it gets sent off to project controls for concurrence on those negotiated values. If project controls agrees, it goes off to the project director for concurrence on those negotiated values. Assuming everything goes smoothly, it is then going to end up with the scope management committee. We generate a document for them to review and sign off on. And if the scope management committee approves of this scope change, it then needs to be signed off on by the appropriate delegation authority. This is all internal MBTA delegation of authority. So depending on the amount that the scope changes for, it'll end up with a different person for signature. And there are a lot of people it can end up for signatures, up to the general manager. However, assuming that the delegated authority approves it and signs it, the process will then generate a final package, much like the previous one, and it'll close out. Looking at this process, it is again an e-builder process, so it will look much the same as the previous one that we reviewed. From the top, we have instructions. Still, please read these instructions. We've spent a lot of time developing them, and they are quite thorough. So I implore you, please do read them. Similarly, we have links, another link to the specific SOP for scope changes, the user guide specific to scope changes, and then we've even developed a report so you can see all the scope changes that have been previously submitted on your project. Now, for the actual information that we require for a scope change to be submitted, very first thing is the PMP document. This should already exist on the project. You should not have to upload a new document. You could just find this in the folder within the project that you're submitting this on. Next is the basic information regarding the scope change. So the CIP ID will be automatically populated. You don't have to worry about that. What's the name of this scope change request? What scope change request number is it? First one's going to be 1, second one's going to be 2, so on. What revision number is this? It's going to start with 0. However, this number will automatically tick up every single time the process is revised back. Next is what phase is the project currently in? Is it in the design phase, or has the project moved on to construction phase? And then lastly, what is the date that you want the scope change to be either approved or denied by? Next off, we ask for the name of the designer. This is a company lookup field. So you see this little blue lookup hyperlink. It'll bring up a new tab and you can search for your company name. If you do work with the MBTA, your name exists within our system and you should be able to find it. So in my example, I'm using AECom. Additionally, we ask for the person who's submitting its title. So who we're interfacing with from the designer. In this case, I put senior project manager, and the designer address. What is the address of your firm? Now we ask for the information specific to the scope change. So what is the approved project scope? This is a free text box. It'll extend for however long you need to type, but please, what is the full project scope that has been approved on this project? Next up is the description of the proposed change. Again, the box will extend, so if it's a long description, do not worry, the box will accommodate. Next is the basis of original design. We also have an optional upload if you have the DoD document. You can provide that as well. However, it is not required. An explanation of why this change was not anticipated in the original baseline. Next is the justification for this proposed change. What is the operational impact of this proposed change? What is the impact if this change was not approved? And then we ask, what will this change require? Will it require a follow-on amendment, a follow-on change order, or a follow-on transfer amendment? Lastly, we ask for some additional supporting documentation. So the charter documentation, again, this should exist in eBuilder already. So if you want to search the folder on the project and find it, you can do that. You could also optionally upload it. And then if your project is tracking assets, you should be aware of ADIS, Asset Data Information Sheets. And whatever ADIS are affected by the scope change, we request that you attach the appropriate sheets. Again, these documents exist within the eBuilder folder structure already. So all we ask is that you find them and attach them. However, once all this information is attached, you can use the submit button. It's both at the top and bottom of the page. It's this fourth button in. And by submitting it, it'll be sent off to project controls for an initial review. And then it will be forwarded on to the project office for their impact assessment. Assuming that all goes smoothly, it will be returning to you for your own impact assessment. And that is what I'm pulling up here. So you can see a bit more details for the instructions because there's a bit more to do on this page. In fact, there are 2 actions that you can take out of this step. We will go over those once I've gone through the entire page layout. Same links as before. So first thing we asked is the externally estimated design cost and schedule impacts. So what is the number of design hours that will be added by changing or adding the scope? Additionally, what is the design cost impact in dollars? The design schedule impact in days. The design cost is a total percentage of the construction cost. And the design cost in dollars per hour. So what is the cost of the design hours? Additionally, we asked for very similar information regarding the construction cost and schedule impacts. So what is the estimated construction cost? This will be the total construction cost after this, assuming this scope change control gets approved. While this second field, the construction cost impact, is the direct cost impact from this scope change control. We also asked for the construction schedule impact in calendar days, the escalation in dollars, and the escalation percentage. Now, the documents that we asked to be provided here is the design scope change proposal. So this is your proposal for the design scope change. You need to upload it here. And optionally, you can also provide the construction cost estimate, along with free text for you to enter any information that you think is relevant for the MBTA to know. The rest of the information that has been provided so far is at the bottom of this page. So if you continue scrolling down, you can see the information that was entered on the start step. So the scope change request tracking information, the designer information, the scope change request information. And then, and the supporting documentation, of course. And then at the very bottom, we have a routing history. Routing history exists on all of our processes. Usually at the very bottom of the page, it shows you who reviewed what and when. It's just a nice at a glance. You can see when things were reviewed, when things were approved, when things were revised. It's not anything that you need to review, but if you want to, you can. Once all this information has been provided, and really it's just the design scope change proposal that is really required after you provide all the impacts from design and construction. You have two actions that you can take. So you see this drop down at the top of the page, you have a submit action. This is going to submit it onto the next reviewer. It's an internal review next. Or you can revise it back to the initiator. Now you might be the initiator if you started this. Alternatively, it could also be the project office. However, if any of these fields that are locked down from the scope change request tracking, designer information, scope change request sections, you need to revise it back to the initiator so that you can modify those sections. Or alternatively, project office can modify those sections. However, assuming everything goes well, you're going to be taking the submit action and forwarding this process, submit action and forwarding this process onto the next reviewer, which is the project office review. All of the rest of the reviews that happen during this process are internal MBTA reviews. And you will not be seeing this again until the very end when the scope change proposal is either approved or rejected. We're looking at here is a completed version of the process. It's gone through all of the reviews. So it went back to the project office for negotiations to occur before going to project controls for concurrence, project director for concurrence, and then the scope management committee for a review. And then lastly, it was signed off on by the appropriate delegation of authority, depending on the amount that the scope change adds to the project. At the very end, we generate a final package. This package is going to be a combination of documents that both you and the project office provided. You can see at a glance whether or not your scope change was approved, highlighted in green, big and bold right at the top. Scrolling down, we have all the documents that were provided throughout this process. We have a routing slip at the top, the scope change request form, which we generate using all the information collected throughout the process. So all the information you provided regarding the scope and the impact the scope will or will not have on the project is in this document, as well as the negotiated schedule impact for both design and construction, the negotiated cost impact for design, construction, escalation, and other soft costs, any follow-on requirements, amendments, change orders, or transfer amendments, who the appropriate delegation authority who signed off on. In this example, it was the deputy chief, the person who submitted it and their title, the designer who reviewed it, and their title, as well as what firm you're a part of and the address. And then lastly, a signature from the delegation of authority signing off on this. Below that, we will have the scope management committee affidavit that was signed. So this again will contain all the names of the people who were a part and who either approved or denied the scope change request, as well as the signature of the co-chair who took action in the e-bill. And then at the very bottom, we have the design scope change proposal that you, the consultant, provided. Very similarly, the process could be denied. Package is slightly different if it is denied. It would not have gone through the delegation of authority, so it will not have that final signature. However, you can see again at a glance, it's in red. You know whether or not your package was or your scope change request was approved or denied. Scrolling down, you have all the same information. We generate the same page with the information that was entered into the process, except there's no classification level selected this time because it never reached the delegation of authority for signature. However, at this point, your scope change proposal has either been approved or denied. You have a final package generated, which will give you record of whether or not it was approved or denied. And from here, the project can continue as normal. And with that, we've gone through the process. Again, both of these processes are mostly internal MBTA processes. We only require limited information or documentation from you, the consultant. And then from there on, everything else happens internally. And you will be notified with the final package once it's either been approved or denied, post the scope management committee approval or denial, and then the delegation of authority for the scope change control process. However, with that, I have completed my demonstration.
And we now open this up for questions. So if you have questions, you can unmute and raise your question this time.
Or people can type them into the chat box.
We did this a little quicker than we would if we had done the initial internal training, because we were able to skip a few steps there, the internal piece. We wanted to focus mostly on the part that you will be involved with. And so that was our focus today. If you are still trying to figure out whether you want to ask questions, I can start with a couple of them. Me ask Rob. You mentioned
I have some hands raised. Actually, sorry about that.
Okay.
Gregory Merlis, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Abby. For the first process, say it's not part of our scope to complete any of the required documentation. It seemed as you scroll through it that all that documentation was required. Is there individual waivers or something that would be submitted, or how is that handled?
There is certain documentation that can be waived, but all that documentation is on the project office to submit. And if there's a waiver, for them to fill out the waiver and submit. And I believe, and Courtney, correct me if I'm wrong, all the documents on that starting page, that is the responsibility of the consultants, are required.
Right, that is correct. So to start the process, the required documents, I believe, are all in the hands of the designer. And so they should provide those documents. There are other documents that will be required from the project office. For instance, the report for the value engineering or the constructability or the risk, those would be supplied by the project office.
Understand, but in a number of projects, those certain items are said, no, we don't need to do those. At least I'll say in the past, and maybe going forward, there will not be situations where project managers say, no, we don't need to do this. So I guess to go off of that, is this, as far as I know, this is implemented now from what I've been told. So is that
Yes.
for any project that is already under agreement, or is it only projects that are in the process of getting negotiated to be worked on?
Any project that is currently in the e-builder process will be subject to these processes. If the project is not yet at 30%, then yes, you'd have to go through the baseline and process. However, if the project gets turned over to capital from any other department that is not a part of the e-builder process, at whatever stage it is submitted, we will do the baselining at that stage. So if it comes over at 75%, we will baseline it at the 75%. However, we are hoping that all projects get paused at the 30% to be baseline. There was something else.
Yeah, one other thing I want to mention is that you do not have to use the establishing baseline scope process if the project is a tier 1 project, so under $1 million, or if it is on call. So there
Right.
are certain exceptions for smaller or very largest projects.
I hope I got the answer. Right? Phil, not quite, George Gregory, sorry.
No, I understand it. I think in my case, I don't have a new project, but I've been told in many cases that, oh yeah, let's not do that. And so that then you just wouldn't have the document to submit at the 30% with this. So that's
Well,
just
Yeah.
seems to be a
sorry.
change that will have to get incorporated going forward.
Since you are as a designer is now being introduced to this process, if you are told we're not going to do this on a project, please bring that up to project controls, and we will take it from there, because we have established this process so that all these things will be required. And this is really to satisfy the FTA requirement. They are the ones who are looking at us and asking, where is your baseline? And so they are looking to ensure that we are following their processes if we are requesting funds from them. So we will not be just waiving things anymore, and especially if they're funded by the FTA.
So Courtney, I have a follow-up question,
Thanks,
and
Dave.
then we have Phil has a question.
Yes.
Is there a particular email address people should be notifying within project controls, or a particular person after you retire?
You had to put that in there, huh?
Sorry, I'm gonna get questions.
Yeah, it will go to Ferris, fhaidar@mbta.com.
Can that go in a follow-up document that we send to people along with the PowerPoint?
Sure.
Rob's making that change now.
Yeah, I'm gonna
Great.
put his email in the chat.
And the reason why I said to go to Ferris is because he will be the co-chair of the committee. So he will be directly involved with moving these processes forward.
Right, but when you send me the final deck to send to everybody, which would be great to have, can you put a slide that has his name and contact information on that deck?
Will do.
Okay, great. And then it looked like Phil had a question.
Yeah, so the project scope change control process, right? That's a new process that's going to be incorporated here. Are you intending on adding a category in the scope and compensation matrix for us to add budget to do this stuff, or should we just be doing that under existing lines, right? Because I would assume this is going to be part of submittals after the 30%. So the 75% and 100% will have to carry budget to go through these processes, right, in our future proposals, cost proposals.
Good question. I know every time we do work, we want to get paid for it, right? So as part of your estimate, your impact, that would be included in your impact estimate. Because you have not only the cost for design itself, but the cost for any other adjustment that you need in order to move this process forward.
Well, yeah, but what I meant was, I guess the whole process. I mean, we have to do a bunch of assessments, right? As part of it, we initiate it, and then there is a designer role for impact assessment, right? So we have to do that. So, or do we just put that under some project management line, or I mean, you could.
That impact assessment, that impact assessment is where you are submitting that change. You got to determine whether or not that change affect construction or just design. If it does affect construction, what is the impact? And that's just part of submitting the change itself, the change request. You're not just going to submit a piece of paper and say, this is the change. We need to know whether or not it affects just design or design and construction. And what is that impact? Is that a monetary impact, or does it also impact by time? For instance, if it's a design impact, will it require additional time to complete that design? So that has to be determined and submitted as part of that package. And like I said, you would incorporate whatever time or in your assessment for the impact.
Yeah, right. I understand that, but I was just saying that doing that work requires hours and budget, and I didn't know if you were going to add lines to the scope and compensation matrix for us to fill out, or a category in there, right, for us to make some assumptions on how long this process will take to go through, versus just putting it, because a lot of the other lines are limited to 5 lines already, right? So we would just be then kind of just consolidating some different tasks into those subcategories under those major categories in the scope and compensation matrix.
If you have to fill out scope and compensation matrix, then you are presuming that this task is approved and a change order or a amendment is required. And then you would be doing a new scope and compensation matrix. At that point, you can fill in the information in whatever that category, right? It would be difficult for me to determine. Well, I could find a line and drop it in there, find a category, a new category, and put it in for changes. But let me think about it and get back to you on that. All right.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I can follow up with you if we need to. Thank you.
That means I got to get it done by next week.
Then in the chat box, it says on the MBTA review process and the review checkpoints, I guess if that is denied, will that automatically stop the review process and be returned, or does it go through all reviewers before being returned?
No, it should stop. With the change that we're doing now, where the memo is submitted and the committee reviews it before it goes into the process. So if the committee decides that they want to move forward with this change, then there was the process would not start. So it would stop at that wherever the rejection comes in.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from Andrew Brunt.
Thanks, Abby. Just a question, and I apologize if this was covered. Has it been determined, I guess, this is more for the changes after the 30%, you know, how micro or macro a scope change would need to go through the process? Is it, you know, because obviously there's design development from 30 to 75%, but is there, you know, is there a level of what level of changes, you know, Courtney used the example, that's a pretty macro example of adding an escalator in when you're doing an elevator project. But I was just curious whether it's been determined how micro the scope needs to go through that process. Thanks.
If it was not initially intended to be part of the function of the initial scope, then it would have to go through this process. So it might be minor. I don't know how you would distinguish this minor change, but yeah, if it's something different from what was originally intended, that is not scope development, it would have to go through this process. And bear in mind that the scope change process here is different from the design scope change request, design change request. Right, that is during construction. That's different from just the scope change. As I mentioned, if you get different site conditions that is in the process of construction, that is addressed by a DCR and not necessarily the scope change.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thank you. See, Gregory has another question.
Thank you, Courtney. To go on that is, does this process have to be completed when there is a DCR issued during construction as well? Or is this strictly only when it's in design?
No, if there is a DCR, there is a process for that already in eBuilder. We wouldn't have to incorporate this process.
Okay. And then to determine the level of change as was being asked, with, you know, obviously an escalator being added is a significant thing, but say you're just, you know, your scope is to just install bench arms on benches throughout a bus station, and now they say, you know what, we're going to have you have included in the package, you know, sanding all the benches as well and varnishing them or painting them or what have you. Is that a change that would have to go through, or is there a dollar value like you'd associate an impact, or is it anything?
Yes. It's not the criteria is not based on the dollar value. It is the function of the scope, whatever the scope is and the function. If you're using the benches with arms on a bench, I think if somebody comes by and says, oh, by the way, put backs on those benches, yeah, it might not be significant, but yeah, that we would consider a change.
Okay. Thank you.
The sanding and painting might just be development. I mean, you not necessarily required for the scope change. Yes, I was going to help out with asking a question. You mentioned, Rob, that there is a free text that we can enter anything. Does that mean we enter an essay, or is there a limit of characters that we can enter in that?
There is technically a limit on those free text boxes. However, I will be very impressed if you hit it. It is a very high number, so you should not run into any issues when entering text into those fields.
Okay, thank you. I have some other frequently asked questions that we had received during our internal training. Let me hit one or two of them. How much time will this process add to the overall design process? Especially for the baseline and process. It should not add any additional time if now we are allowing the design to progress while the review is taking place. For the scope change, it should take about 2 weeks. So it's not a lot of time, but I guess that is some impact. And we will be monitoring the process so that it's not dwelling in any one court for too long or on somebody's desk for too long. Right? And project controls will be monitoring that.
Any other questions? Oh. Are there any other questions?
No more questions from there. I have another one I can ask. Who will verify that the comments from the PDG are incorporated into the baseline scope? And that is the requirement of both the designer and the project manager. You have the obligation to validate, and you will see in the process, there is a question asked, were all comments incorporated or addressed? And you would have to respond to that. And then the project manager also have the same question that they have to respond to. So it's the obligation of both the designer and the project manager to validate that all comments have been incorporated or addressed in some manner. There's another question, how can I request an exception for this process? And we stated there is a waiver in the SOP that can be used. All you have to do is access the SOP and get the waiver, submit the waiver, and bear in mind that projects that are tier 1 are in a sense exempt, and projects that are on-call projects, as the scope for on-call projects are usually varied. Take any more questions? No? Nobody's developing any questions?
I am not seeing any more. And
Okay,
you were seeing some directly in your chat box.
no, not seen any in the chat box either.
Okay. Great. Well, I guess we can wrap things up. I will want to thank Courtney and Rob and team for doing this. I'm going to stop the recording.